April 9th, 1940. The North Atlantic, 280 miles west of the Hebrides. Dawn breaks cold and colorless over water the shade of hammered steel. The destroyer, HMS Glowworm, cuts through swells that rise and fall like the breathing of some vast animal beneath the surface. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roop stands with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the horizon through salt-crusted windows. The air smells of diesel, wet rope, and the faint metallic tang of fear that no sailor admits but every sailor knows. Somewhere beneath them, in the crushing darkness where sunlight dies, 5 German U-boats are hunting. And Roop is about to make them believe his ship is dying. This is not the story they taught in naval academies. This is not the tale of guns blazing and torpedoes racing through moonlit water. This is the story of a captain who understood that in modern warfare, the most dangerous weapon is not steel, it is perception. That sometimes survival demands you pretend to be prey. That the hunter can be turned into the hunted not by superior firepower, but by superior deception. What happened over the next 11 hours would become a masterclass in psychological warfare at sea, studied in war colleges for decades to come. But in that frozen April morning, as the first periscope broke the surface 3 miles to starboard, Commander Roop had no certainty his gambit would work. He had only intuition, desperation, and the willingness to stake 149 lives on a performance. The North Atlantic in 1940 was not merely an ocean, it was a killing floor. By April, the U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine had sunk over 750,000 tons of Allied shipping. Merchant vessels, tankers, troop transports turned into coffins of twisted steel and burning oil. Admiral Karl Dunitz's Wolfpack tactics had transformed submarine warfare from isolated attacks into coordinated massacres. German submariners called it Glückliche Zeit, the happy time. British sailors had darker names for it. The Ministry of War Transport recorded that 1 in 4 merchant seamen who went to sea in 1940 would never return. The ocean floor between Liverpool and Halifax was becoming a graveyard measured in square miles. Destroyers like Glowworm were supposed to be the answer. Fast, maneuverable, bristling with depth charges and deck guns, they served as shepherds protecting the slow-moving convoys. But by spring of 1940, even the destroyers were being picked off. U-boats had learned to hunt in packs, surfacing at night to use their superior surface speed, diving at dawn to stalk from below. The mathematics were brutal. Britain had 68 destroyers to patrol an ocean. Germany had 57 operational U-boats, with more sliding down the slipways every month, and every destroyer sent to the bottom meant 5 merchant ships would sail undefended. Commander Roop understood these numbers intimately. At 44, he was old for a destroyer captain, his face weathered by 2 decades at sea. He had fought in the Great War, watched ships burn at Jutland, pulled drowning men from water slick with oil and blood. He knew what it meant to be hunted. And on the morning of April 9th, with Glowworm separated from her convoy group by a navigation error and thick fog, he knew his ship had become exactly what the wolf packs dreamed of, a lone destroyer, isolated, ripe for the killing. The first indication came at 08:20 hours. Sonar operator Petty Officer James Hendricks, hunched over his equipment in the cramped ASDAC compartment, detected the characteristic echo return of a submarine hull, bearing 095, range 4,500 yards. Then another, and another. Within 6 minutes, Hendricks had identified 5 distinct contacts, moving in a coordinated search pattern that could only mean one thing: they had been found. On the bridge, Roop received the report without visible reaction. He walked to the chart table, traced his finger across the plotting sheet showing their position. The nearest friendly naval base was Scapa Flow, 340 miles northeast. The convoy they were supposed to rejoin was somewhere in the fog bank to the west. Around them, in a loose semicircle, tightening by the minute, 5 Type 7B U-boats were moving into attack formation. Standard doctrine was clear: increase to flank speed, zigzag, run. Destroyers were faster than submarines, at least on the surface. Make a dash for friendly waters, call for air support, hope to outlast the pursuit. Roop stood at the chart for 3 minutes, saying nothing. His officers watched him, waiting. Outside, the sea rolled gray and indifferent. Finally, Roop straightened. His next words would have earned him a court-martial if anyone had been around to hear them. All engines stop. Prepare to simulate engineering casualty. What the German commanders expected was routine. They had sunk 4 destroyers in the previous month using textbook tactics: coordinate approach vectors, wait for the target to commit to an escape bearing, then surface and bracket with deck guns while the submerged boats maneuvered for torpedo solutions. Destroyers always ran. That was the game. The U-boat commanders, veterans all, men who wore the Iron Cross and calculated kill tonnage like bankers counting money, had refined the hunt to a science. A lone destroyer meant approximately 1,400 tons added to their patrol total, plus the propaganda value of sinking a Royal Navy warship. They were already composing the radio messages they would send to Lorient, already imagining the congratulations from Dönitz himself. What they found instead was confusion. At 0834, Glowworm began to slow. Black smoke poured from her stacks. Too much smoke. The thick, greasy kind that meant fuel problems or overheated bearings. Her speed dropped from 28 knots to 18, then 12. The destroyer began to list slightly to port, her bow wave diminishing to a sluggish ripple. Through their periscopes, the U-boat commanders watched with the predatory intensity of wolves seeing a deer stumble. This was even better than expected. The destroyer was crippled. The kill would be effortless. Kapitän Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann, commanding U-47 from his position at the periscope in the attack periscope, felt the familiar surge of satisfaction. His boat had sunk 11 Allied ships since the war began. This would be number 12. He snapped orders in the clipped German used aboard submarines. Flood tubes 1 and 3. Range 3 to 900 meters. Bearing 275. Prepare to fire on my mark. Around him in the cramped control room, his crew moved with practiced efficiency. The torpedo room reported tubes ready. The engineering officer confirmed perfect trim. Everything was textbook. Everything was as it should be. Hartmann allowed himself a thin smile. Another few minutes, and the destroyer would be fish food. What Hartmann could not see, what none of the U-boat commanders could see, was the theater being performed aboard Glowworm. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Lieutenant Thomas Watts had shut down the port turbine and was deliberately injecting raw fuel into the exhaust system to create black smoke. On deck, damage control parties were lowering lifeboats halfway, then stopping, visible through periscopes as signs of panic and preparation to abandon ship. Roop himself stood on the bridge wing, clearly visible, gesturing to officers in what appeared to be heated argument. Every detail was calculated, every movement designed to whisper the same message into the periscopes aimed at them. We are wounded. We are helpless. Come closer. The bait worked because it confirmed what the hunters expected. Cognitive bias is not limited to land warfare. Submarine commanders, like all predators, see what they anticipate seeing. A destroyer slowing with smoke damage was a scenario they had trained for, had encountered before. It fit their mental model of naval combat. What did not fit, what was unthinkable, was that a destroyer captain would deliberately feign vulnerability. That required a kind of recklessness that bordered on madness. Roop was counting on that disbelief. He was weaponizing the enemy's own experience against them. By 0850, all 5 U-boats had closed to within 2,000 yards. They maintained depth, circling like sharks, coordinates being shared between boats through short underwater acoustic signals. The plan was forming. 3 boats would surface simultaneously, use their 88mm deck guns to disable the destroyer's weapons, while the remaining 2 moved into ideal torpedo firing positions. It was overwhelming force against a crippled target. There was no possibility of failure. Hartman, communicating through hydrophone with the other boat commanders, felt the cold professional pleasure of a perfect solution. In 10 minutes, it would be over. At 0858, Roop gave the order. All ahead flank. Hard starboard rudder. Battle. Stations. Commence firing pattern Delta 7. Glowworm exploded into motion. Her turbines, which had never actually been damaged, roared to full power. The casualty smoke vanished as if wiped away by an invisible hand. Her bow, lifted as 36,000 shaft horsepower, drove her from 12 knots to 34 in under 40 seconds. And she turned, not away from the U-boats, but directly into the center of their formation, her course calculated not by fleeing prey, but by a predator who had just revealed his teeth. The U-boat commanders had perhaps 5 seconds to process what was happening before the destroyer was among them. Not hunting them from a distance with sonar and depth charges, but among them, in the dead space too close for torpedoes, where their greatest advantage, the ability to strike unseen from range, became meaningless. Roop had turned the ocean into a knife fight, and in a knife fight, the destroyer's armor and deck guns mattered more than the submarine's stealth. Depth charges began to fall from Glowworm's stern in a pattern that had been pre-calculated during the 26 minutes of engine failure. Roop had used the time not to panic, but to plot. Every bearing, every range estimate from sonar had been logged. Now those calculations became 300-pound cylinders of Torpex explosive, set to detonate at depths where U-boats had no choice but to be. The water erupted in columns of white that rose 50 feet, each explosion propagating pressure waves that could crush a submarine hull like a beer can under a boot. U-47 took the first pattern. Hartman felt the shock wave before he heard it, a hammer blow that snapped his teeth together and sent every unsecured object in the control room flying. Light bulbs shattered, the periscope well cracked, seawater beginning to spray in thin jets that tasted of salt and iron. Damage reports came screaming from every compartment: flooding in the forward torpedo room, hydraulic failure in the dive planes, electrical fire in the battery compartment. The boat that had been a predator 30 seconds ago was now a wounded animal, diving deep, desperate to escape into the dark, crushing pressure where destroyers could not follow. But Roop was not finished. As Glowworm raced through the formation, her deck guns, 4.7-inch QF Mark XIII naval rifles that could fire 15 rounds per minute, began hammering at the submarines that broke surface in confusion. U-52 surfaced directly in front of the destroyer's path, her captain making the instinctive but fatal decision to emergency blow tanks and run on the surface. Glowworm's forward turret caught her while she was still wallowing in her own foam, shells walking up the submarine's deck in neat explosive punctuation. The U-boat's pressure hull cracked like an egg. She went down in 40 seconds, her conning tower vanishing beneath water already frothing with leaking fuel oil and the bodies of men who never made it out. The symbolic object that haunted the survivors, those German submariners who were pulled from the water by other U-boats after the battle, was not a weapon or a flag. It was a sound. The steady ping-ping-ping of Glowworm's active sonar, echoing through the water like the heartbeat of something vast and inexorable. In their training, they had learned that active sonar was a weakness, a sign that the hunter was blind, sending out desperate calls into the darkness. But now that sound became the metronome of their terror, because every ping was followed by depth charges, by shells, by the unstoppable mass of a destroyer that had transformed from prey to apex predator in the span of a heartbeat. Years later, U-boat veterans would wake sweating from nightmares where that sound pursued them through endless dark water. The battle, if it can be called that, when one side has been psychologically gutted before the shooting begins, lasted 17 minutes. 3 U-boats damaged, 2 sunk, the survivors scattering to different compass points, radioing emergency status reports, their confidence shattered. Glowworm sustained minor damage from one torpedo that passed within meters of her hull, too close for its arming mechanism to trigger, and shell splinters from a brief exchange with U-64. 7 wounded, none killed. By 0920, the destroyer was alone again on empty ocean, her crew stunned by what they had just accomplished. Roop did not celebrate. He walked through the ship, checking damage, speaking quietly to wounded men, ensuring the engineering spaces were secure. In his private log, recovered after the war, he wrote only, "Enemy contact resolved," proceeding to rejoin convoy. But his officers, his crew, had witnessed something that would define their understanding of warfare for the rest of their lives. They had seen the ocean itself turned into a weapon. They had seen psychological warfare conducted at 34 knots with 5,000 tons of steel. They had seen their captain stake all their lives on an act of theater, on the calculated gamble that enemies see what they expect, not what is true. The German records, declassified in the 1970s, reveal the aftermath. Admiral Dönitz, receiving the loss reports, initially refused to believe a single destroyer had defeated a coordinated wolf pack. An investigation was launched. The surviving commanders were interrogated, their decisions analyzed, their tactical judgments questioned. What emerged was not fault, but fundamental miscalculation. The U-boats had assumed behavior based on established patterns. They had trusted their experience. They had believed the script they thought the war was following. Roop had simply written a different script and performed it perfectly. The transformation this battle caused rippled through both navies. British Admiralty began teaching aggressive deception, the concept that appearing weak could become a tactical weapon. Destroyer captains started experimenting with false signals, simulated damage, psychological feints. The Germans, conversely, became paranoid. U-boat commanders began to distrust easy targets, to see traps in every wounded ship. The Battle of the Atlantic became not just a contest of tonnage and technology, but of perception and nerve. Roop's 11 hours of deception changed the calculus of naval warfare in ways that cannot be measured in ships sunk or lives saved, but in the space between what appears to be true and what actually is. Commander Roop did not survive the war. On April 10, 1940, one day after his triumph, Glowworm encountered the German heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper during the invasion of Norway. Outgunned and with no opportunity for deception, Roop rammed the cruiser before his ship was blown apart. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. But that final act of desperate courage, though it earned immortal honor, obscures the more profound achievement of April 9th. The day he proved that the most dangerous captain is not the one with the heaviest guns or the fastest ship, but the one who understands that war is theater, that perception is reality, that the enemy's expectations can be turned into chains. The 5 U-boats, or rather, the 3 that survived, never operated as a pack again. Their commanders were scattered to different flotillas. In post-war interviews, some of them described April 9th as the day they stopped feeling invincible. When you have been the hunter for so long, When you have grown accustomed to the power that comes from striking unseen, the revelation that you can be deceived, that your eyes and instruments and experience can all conspire to lie to you, cracks something fundamental. The U-boat service would sink millions more tons of shipping before war's end. But something changed that April morning west of the Hebrides. The hunters learned they could be hunted. The wolves learned that sheep might have teeth. There is a photograph taken by a reconnaissance Sunderland that flew over Glowworm later that day. The destroyer is cutting through calm seas, her wake a white arrow pointing north. If you look carefully, you can see damage control parties still on deck, repairing the splinter holes in her hull. But what strikes everyone who sees the photo is how ordinary she looks. Just another gray ship on a gray ocean, indistinguishable from 100 others. Nothing in her silhouette suggests what happened. Nothing reveals the intelligence or the nerve required to turn weakness into weapon, prey into predator. She looks, in every visible way, like a ship that could fail. Perhaps that was always her greatest strength. The lesson Roop taught is not taught in neat lectures or tactical manuals. It is the lesson that war is not a mechanism, but a story, and whoever controls the story controls the outcome. That the enemy's mind is as much a battlefield as the ocean. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is pretend to be afraid. That the difference between defeat and victory can be 26 minutes of performance art conducted with smoke and slow engines, and the absolute conviction that predators can be fooled, because predators want to believe their prey is weak. On quiet nights, in the wardrooms of naval vessels that still patrol that same stretch of North Atlantic, officers who know the story sometimes toast the phantom limp. They toast the captain who refused to run. They toast the 11 hours when a destroyer became something else. A trap, a lie, a dare spoken in steel and smoke. They toast the understanding that survival sometimes demands you look like you are dying, that victory sometimes requires you to appear defeated, that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is the space between what the enemy sees and what is actually there, waiting in the dark water with its teeth bared. And somewhere on the ocean floor, beneath miles of black pressure and cold, the wrecks of 2 U-boats rest in the silt, their hulls still bearing the scars of the day they learned that sometimes prey evolves.